Entitled Biotechnology and Stewardship. The library sponsors two main lectures and lecture series, the House of Learning Lecture Series and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship Lecture. Through these lectures, the library brings together scholars and students to engage in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to the building of a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning Lecture Series title is taken from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the campus repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge, and is honored to provide this House of Learning lecture today. Now, about today's speaker. Professor Coleman was raised in the San Francisco Bay Area of Northern California, and after a mission to the Argentina Buenos Aires North Mission, earned a B.S. in botany at BYU in 1985, and an MS in genetics in 1987, also at BYU. He pursued doctoral work in molecular and cell biology and received a PhD in that field from Penn State University in 1992. For 4 years, he worked as a postdoctoral scientist at the University of Arizona before coming to BYU in 1996. Professor Coleman is a prolific and respected plant biologist, and in August 2006 was co-author of this article, Ecological Significance of Microsatellite Variation in Western North American Populations of Bromus tectorum. For those of us who don't know, Bromus tectorum is another name for cheatgrass. So even weeds, it seems, have friends. In addition to his scholarship, Professor Coleman is a role model for young minds, encouraging thoughtful inquiry, reasoned conclusions, and lifelong discipleship. It is a pleasure to welcome today our House of Learning speaker, Professor Craig Coleman.
Well, thank you, Brian, for that very kind introduction, and I appreciate the invitation to come and speak to you in this lecture series about the House of Learning and the role of the university in establishing a House of Learning. And when I received that invitation, the first thing I did was to look at that verse and really give some thought as to how what I was doing at BYU is contributing to the establishment of a House of Learning. As Brian has already quoted the scripture from the Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, I won't do that, but it really made me reflect on how my research, which I consider to be equivalent to study, as it's mentioned in that particular verse, and how my faith intersect, and how that is defining what I am doing as a faculty member and what I profess as a professor at Brigham Young University. I want to start, first of all, by talking about stewardship and what stewardship means to me, and what I think it means in terms of Christian discipleship. And I'm going to start by referring to Matthew chapter 25. Now, if you remember, just prior to the crucifixion, the Savior called his disciples together and gave them some instruction regarding things that were to come, and also regarding their role in the kingdom once he was gone. And so Matthew 25 is actually a very interesting chapter in outlining what our role is as Christian disciples in the kingdom of God. And it really consists of three parables. If you recall, the first parable is the parable of the 10 virgins. And this is a painting by William Blake of the parable of the 10 virgins. If you recall, 5 of the virgins were wise and had oil in their lamps, and 5 were foolish and did not have oil in their lamps. And the common interpretation of this parable, of course, is that those who were wise and had oil were spiritually prepared for the coming of the Lord and prepared to meet him, whereas those who were foolish were unprepared. In contrast to the parable of the 10 virgins is the parable of the talents, which immediately follows that in Matthew chapter 25. And this provides a little bit different insight into our responsibilities as Christian disciples. In this parable, 3 individuals, 3 stewards, receive from the master varying quantities of talents. One receives 5 talents, one receives 2, and the other receives 1. And then the master departs for a while, and the stewards are left to themselves to do with those talents as they will. When the master returns, then he calls those stewards together and requires of them an accounting. And the steward that had received 5 talents reports that he had obtained 5 more, for a total of 10, and the steward that had 2 talents had also doubled his stewardship and now had 4 talents, whereas the steward that had only received 1 talent had hidden his in the earth and did not have any increase at all. And of course, the Lord says to the 2 wise servants, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things." The indication from this parable is that stewards are entrusted with the goods of the master, are required to provide an increase, not just maintain what they've been given, but actually to do good works that will result in an increase in what they've been given. And in contrast, the individual that received only 1 talent and no increase receives a condemnation from the Lord. But what this parable doesn't actually outline very clearly is what exactly is it that the Lord expected of these individuals to do in order to increase their talents. And I think that the next parable, which is the parable of the sheep and goats, gives us a little bit of insight into what the Lord expects of us in terms of that providing for that increase. If you remember that parable, the Lord talks about separating the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. And I'd just like to read that parable because I think it's very important. This is what he says: "When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was an hungered, and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger, and ye took me in. Naked, and ye clothed me. I was sick, and ye visited me. I was in prison, and ye came unto me. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered, and fed thee, or thirsty, and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger, and took thee in, or naked, and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick, or in prison, and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me. Then shall he say unto them on the left hand, Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. I interpret this to mean that in the parable of the talents, what the Lord is really asking us to do is clarified in the parable of the sheep and goats, and that is to use our talents in such a way that we improve the human condition. And I think that is an excellent definition of wise stewardship as it relates to Christian discipleship. This is also indicated in modern Scripture. If we turn to Doctrine and Covenants, section 104, the Lord is talking about stewardship in a very direct way, and indicates that the depth of our spirituality and how prepared we are is dependent on how willing we are to show to share our substance for the care of God's children. Let me read a couple of verses from section 104. He says, "It is wisdom in me, therefore, a commandment I give unto you, that ye shall organize yourselves and appoint every man his stewardship, that every man may give an account unto me of the stewardship which is appointed unto him. For it is expedient that I, the Lord, should make every man accountable as a steward over earthly blessings, which I have made and prepared for my creatures. I, the Lord, stretched out the heavens and built the earth, my very handiwork, and all things therein are mine. It is my purpose to provide for my saints, and all things are mine. But it must needs be done in mine own way. And behold, this is the way that I, the Lord, have decreed, to provide for my saints, that the poor shall be exalted, in that the rich are made low. For the earth is full, and there is enough and to spare. Yea, I prepared all things, and have given unto the children of men to be agents unto themselves. Therefore, if any man shall take of the abundance which I have made, and impart not his portion according to the law of my gospel unto the poor and the needy, he shall with the wicked lift up his eyes in hell, being in torment. The fullness of the earth, its abundance, therefore, is contingent upon our wise use of the resources that the Lord has given to us. We cannot expect abundance if we are ourselves selfish or greedy, or hoard to ourselves the things that the Lord has given to us. In addition to Scripture, we have the words of modern-day prophets. For instance, President Kimball gave advice in many cases about our responsibilities as Christian disciples and as wise stewards of the Lord's kingdom. This, in particular, quote is taken from First Presidency message, which was published in June of 1976, entitled "The False Gods We Worship." And I would recommend to anyone to get that particular article and read it. It's very good. But this is taken from that First Presidency message. He says, "Many people spend most of their time working in the service of a self-image that includes sufficient money, stocks, bonds, investment portfolios, property, credit cards, furnishings, automobiles, and the like, to guarantee carnal security throughout, it is hoped, a long and happy life. Forgotten is the fact that our assignment is to use these many resources in our families and quorums to build up the kingdom of God, to further the missionary effort and the genealogical and temple work, to raise our children up as fruitful servants unto the Lord, to bless others in every way that they may also be fruitful." I think that's a very important point, and I want to emphasize that. It says, to bless others in every way that they may also be fruitful. Instead, we expend these blessings on our own desires, and as Moroni said, "Ye adorn yourselves with that which hath no life, and yet suffer the hungry and the needy and the naked and the sick and the afflicted to pass by you, and notice them not." So I've emphasized this idea of using our resources to bless others in every way, because I really want to focus on that, not because I don't think it's necessarily important than the other items that President Kimball mentions, but that's where I want to put my emphasis. So now what I want to do is let me show this graph and introduce the next phase of my talk. Is what this graph shows is world population development, or world population growth, projected to the next half century, to 2050. And you can see this is what is commonly referred to as the J-shaped curve, because of exponential growth in human population as projected. It's expected that by the year 2050, there may be as many as 10 billion people on the earth. Right now, it's estimated there's about 6.5 billion people. That's a lot of people. And you can see that a lot of that growth is actually occurring. In fact, the majority of the growth will be occurring in developing nations rather than in the industrialized countries, such as the United States. And so, as we look at this, we can anticipate that there may be some fairly significant problems that come with such rapid population growth. And we might ask ourselves the question, is the earth really full enough to accommodate this many people? Do we have enough resources to be able to feed and clothe people in such a way that they can be comfortable, so that we can fulfill the injunction that has been given to us in the scriptures and by modern day prophets to bless the lives of others and to see that they can also be fruitful? People have looked at graphs like this, and they've made some rather dire predictions about what's going to happen in the world. Maybe not the first, but perhaps the most famous individual to make this kind of prediction was Thomas Malthus, who was a political economist, a British political economist, mathematician. And he predicted some very dire circumstances regarding Earth's population. He wrote his essay on population in the late 1700s, around the turn of the century, and our essay on the principle of population. This is what he had to say. He said, "The power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race. The vices of mankind are active and able ministers of depopulation. They are the precursors in the great army of destruction and often finish the dreadful work themselves. But should they fail in this war of extermination, sickly seasons, epidemics, pestilence, and plague advance in terrific array and sweep off their thousands and tens of thousands. Should success be still incomplete, gigantic inevitable famine stalks in the rear, and with one mighty blow levels the population with the food of the world." This is a pretty powerful statement, and Malthus's writings were actually very influential in the thinking of a variety of individuals, including Karl Marx, Charles Darwin, Julian Huxley, and Paul Ehrlich. In a minute, I'll talk about Paul Ehrlich. But Malthus proposed some rather draconian measures to overcome these problems of overpopulation. He actually proposed what's called moral restraint. That is, he wanted people to either marry late or practice sexual abstinence, and particularly in the working and the poorer classes of people. And this was his way of overcoming the problem of overpopulation, as well as overcoming the problems of poverty. And as I mentioned, his thinking also influenced more modern thinking. For instance, is exemplified in this book, The Population Bomb, by Paul Ehrlich, a Stanford University professor. Dr. Ehrlich predicted as well that overpopulation of the earth and limited resources would result in an enormous crash and depopulation of the planet. And his solutions for the problems were even more draconian than those of Thomas Malthus, and proposing that entire populations should be eliminated and starve to death if they did not adopt control measures to limit the populations in certain countries. And he predicted that these rapid declines in population would occur in the 1970s and 1980s. Of course, that did not happen, and for a variety of reasons. Both Malthus and Ehrlich were wrong, and a lot of their errors in retrospect, as we look back, were in the way that they modeled population growth and also the increase in the food supply. And so it's instructive for us to look back and maybe think about why, in fact, population has not declined as rapidly as these gentlemen thought that it would. One reason is because of our ability to increase food production. Now, this chart shows the increase in per capita food, or decrease, whichever line you want to look at. Changes is probably a better word, and that's why I put it in the title. Changes in per capita food production over the last 40 years in tropical Asia and also in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you look at this chart, you can see there's a dramatic change that is occurring around 1970 in tropical Asia. And the trend seems to be going up. So what is going on here? Well, what is going on here, of course, is the so-called Green Revolution. The Green Revolution was essentially a revolution in agricultural production. It was driven mainly by the efforts of a man by the name of Norman Borlaug. Norman Borlaug was an agronomist who worked at an agricultural breeding center for wheat breeding center in Mexico, beginning in the mid-1940s. His project was funded by the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations, and after some initial struggles, what he began to concentrate on was developing new strains of wheat. One of the problems that wheat had is that if you increase the yield, or the amount of seed that a particular wheat plant produces, the weight of the head becomes too heavy and the plant will fall over before you can harvest it. And what happens, of course, is if the wheat plants are all prone, laying down on the ground, it's a little bit difficult to run your combine over it and to harvest it. And so what he did was to breed varieties of wheat in which the stalk was thicker and more sturdy. These were called semi-dwarf varieties of wheat. And that allowed him to plant those wheat varieties on soil that had higher fertility. And so what he was doing, of course, was applying inorganic fertilizers to the soils and then putting these varieties of wheat so that they could produce more seed per wheat. And he dramatically increased yields that way. In fact, by 1963, the total wheat production in Mexico was 6 times that which it had been in 1944 on relatively the same amount of land. And so he was able to dramatically increase production of wheat in Mexico such that it became a net exporter of wheat rather than an importer of wheat as it had been prior to Norman Borlaug's efforts. Well, scientists in India and Pakistan saw what he was doing in Mexico, and they arranged through the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations for him to come to Asia and bring those varieties of wheat with him so that he could plant them in those countries as well. And that expanded the Green Revolution to Asia, as you can see here, so that by 1974, both India and Pakistan became net exporters of wheat as well. What you also see here is that the Green Revolution apparently had no effect in Africa in the 1970s. And you see per capita food production in Africa going down. And of course, we know in the 1970s and 1980s, and even continuing today, there are severe problems with famine in Africa. Now, that trend changes a little bit in 1980. People began to ask the question in the early 1980s, why is it that Africa has not benefited from the Green Revolution as has Asia and many parts of Latin America? And Norman Borlaug was convinced to come out of semi-retirement in the 1980s and to help with projects in Africa to, in terms of breeding new varieties of plants that he could use to improve it, particularly with maize and sorghum and cassava. And so Africa began to benefit from some of these kinds of agricultural practices that Norman Borlaug had developed. Okay, now if we want to consider then what we can do if we're going to have to consign ourselves to the idea that population is going to expand, we really then have to ask ourselves the question, what can we do to help increase food production to meet the growing demand of a global population? So I've listed 4 ways in which we can potentially increase food production. Number 1 is to bring more land into production. Number 2 is to improve agricultural practices. Number 3 is to promote conventional breeding practices to improve varieties of crops. And then finally, number 4 is to use biotechnology as a tool to improve crop production. I'm just going to briefly talk about each of those 4. First of all, with regards to land use, it's estimated that there are 3.2 billion acres of arable land worldwide, not including pastures and pasture land that's used for grazing animals. That's a lot of land. What I mean by arable land is that's usable land. They're the richest and the best land that can be used for the production of crops. And that's about, well, out of 57 million square miles on the Earth's surface, about, if we talk about it in square miles, 12 million of those are arable. If we increase land use, because most of the good land, if not all of the good land, is already in production. So if we increase land use, it's going to be it's going to come at a terrible cost environmentally. You can see this picture here, which is a slash and burn, where this is a process whereby deforestation occurs, so that the forest is cut down, it is burned, and then that land is used for agriculture. The fertility of such soils are not very high. And in addition, even if we're not using slash and burn agriculture, the kinds of lands that would have to be brought into production are usually going to be in poor climates, where there are going to be problems with temperature extremes, with drought, or there's going to be low fertility in the soil, that's low soil nutrients for plant growth, or high salinity. So we're not going to get very good production out of those kinds of lands anyway. So bringing new land into production is probably not a very good way of doing things. We could improve agronomic practices. This could include increasing soil fertility, preventing erosion, increased mechanization, new methods and improved methods of irrigation, pest control, both insects, bacterial microorganism pests, or viruses, weeds as well. Also, for example, Israel has developed some very sophisticated techniques for irrigation and essentially become self-sustainable by converting what was really a desert into arable land. Despite the fact that there are advances in agricultural practices, many areas of the world lag behind and could benefit from these improved agronomic practices if we could bring them to them. The third way that I mentioned is by conventional breeding. If you go to the grocery store and you look at the foods that are available on the shelf, many of those foods have been brought to you by conventional breeding techniques. That is, breeding superior varieties or varieties of these crop plants that have desirable characteristics and combining them into hybrid plants to produce the kinds of fruits and vegetables that you expect to see on the produce counter. In fact, it's this kind of work in improving varieties that was at the heart of the Green Revolution. The problem with conventional breeding is that it's very slow and laborious, and it can often take 10 to 15 years to bring new varieties to market into the farmer's field so that they can produce more of it. So what has been happening in recent years is that complementing these conventional breeding techniques is biotechnology. Biotechnological advances in gene manipulation, in understanding patterns of inheritance in plants and in crop plants, and understanding the role of DNA in determining which characteristics plants have, has great promise and great potential for increasing crop yields. In fact, some of the goals that biotechnological researchers have in terms of agriculture is to increase crop yields, reduce usage of chemicals and water inputs, increase resistance to crop stress, like low water or high salt, cold and heat extremes, smaller losses from spoilage, that's increasing shelf life, using crop plants to produce medicines and vaccines, and also to increase and improve nutritional value of crops. Now, of course, there are a number of objections to using biotechnology for crop improvement that have been raised by opponents of biotechnology, and these can fall into several categories. People are concerned of the environmental impact that engineered plants might have. They're concerned about the impact that new varieties of crop plants would have on human health. And they're also concerned that the technology itself is concentrated in the hands of a few multinational corporations. and may not be available to people who really could benefit from the technology. Or it would come at a very high cost, including control of those, the production of crops by the corporations that have control over the technology. I think if we are going to understand, though, we really need to understand what biotechnology means. And so I want to take a minute to describe what is meant by biotechnology. First of all, I'm going to really separate it into two categories. One is we understand biotechnology to mean the using molecular biology, biochemistry to understand how characters are controlled within a plant organism. So we really want to understand what is going on with the DNA. One of the great advances that we've seen in the last several decades is the ability to manipulate DNA and the ability to peer right into the genes, the chemical structure of the genes, and to be able to make correlations between the structure of the DNA. Okay, and what I mean by the structure is the sequence of nucleotide bases that make up a piece of DNA. So the structure of the DNA and specific traits that we're interested in. Now I'm going to show this slide here, and it might not make sense to a lot of people, but what this really is an agarose gel. This is a gel in which we've separated pieces of DNA from different individuals. So you can see a series of lanes in which DNA has been loaded from different individuals. And you can see that each lane has a different pattern. What we've been able to do is to correlate these kinds of patterns with particular traits that crop plants have. And we can identify very early on which patterns correlate with those traits and then be able to select which plants we want to use in a breeding program. And so this process is called marker-assisted selection. So we select for varieties that have particular traits, but we don't even have to see the plant express that trait. We can look directly at the DNA itself when the plant is quite young, and we can, through those means, we can greatly accelerate a breeding program. DNA markers can also be used to characterize germplasm collections so that we can preserve different varieties of crop plants and thereby preserve what we call biodiversity, because we want variability in our crop plants as well. This kind of biotechnology is, on its face, rather non-controversial. No one particularly objects to this particular kind of use of molecular biology to improve crop production. What they do object to is genetic engineering. And in the last couple of decades, techniques have been developed to transfer genes into plants, single genes. And that doesn't even have to be from another plant organism. You can take genes from bacteria, you can take it from animals, you can take it from wherever you want, and move those genes from those other organisms into plant organisms. If you think, or if you can do experiments to determine if those genes will actually improve the crop in some way. Now what I'm showing here might seem rather mysterious to you. It's a micrograph, an electron micrograph of a plant cell that is covered with agrobacterium. And agrobacterium is the tool that plant biologists use to transfer genes from one organism to another. Okay? And that is being done on a regular basis. In fact, this process is what generates what we call transgenics, or genetically modified organisms. There are a lot of acres in the world now that are planted in genetically modified organisms. The latest data that I found was for 2003. And worldwide, there are 167 million acres planted with GM crops in 2003, of which 105.7 of those are in the United States. 34.4 million in Argentina. There's also GM crops in Canada, Brazil, China, and South Africa, and in a few other countries. Noticeably absent from the list are any European countries. The Europeans are not very pleased with genetically modified organisms at all. In fact, that has a very chilling effect on our ability to bring genetically modified organisms to other countries that might benefit from them. In the United States, corn, soybeans, cotton, canola, squash, papaya are all grown as genetically modified organisms. Not all acreage, but a significant amount of acreage in those crops. our planet in transgenic crops. And there are people who have objections, as I mentioned before, concerns, environmental concerns, human health concerns, and also concerns about who controls that technology. But we might also ask ourselves the question, has this technology have we been able to transfer this technology into the developing world? And that's really the next question that I want to address. Because the developing world could potentially benefit from the technology, both in terms of DNA marker technology as well as transgenic technology. However, there's sort of been a lag in being able to do that, particularly in terms of transgenics, primarily because of the attitude in Europe against genetically modified organisms. Several years ago, the United States shipped food to Africa as a humanitarian effort, and that food sat on the docks in Africa because officials in some of the countries where it arrived were concerned that it was transgenic, and so they let it sit on the docks and rot rather than distributing it to their hungry population because of those concerns. And essentially what these developing countries are saying is that they don't want to be the guinea pigs. They don't want to be the ones to find out whether these crops are good or not. There are, however, some organizations that are promoting the use of molecular biology and DNA marker technology in developing countries. The Challenge program, for instance, Future Harvest Centers as part of the consultative group on international agriculture. And as well, I want to mention the McKnight Foundation, the McKnight Foundation's Collaborative Crop Research Program, of which we have a project under its auspices here at Brigham Young University to study this crop here, which I'm showing on this slide. This is Chenopodium quinoa, or simply known as quinoa. This is a crop that grows on the high Andean plateau of South America. This is a funded project by the McKnight Foundation that has been developed to improve production, not only in terms of new varieties, but also in terms of improved agricultural practices, education, teaching the people how to use the quinoa and how to grow it, and as well also for germplasm collection. So as I mentioned, this crop grows on the high Andean plateau. It's grown both by subsistence farmers as well as commercial growers. The subsistence farmers still use very labor-intensive methods for planting and harvesting the crop, as well as the commercial farmers. So this is actually a commercial operation where they're threshing the quinoa. And quinoa, it's the seed that's consumed, by the way. So I know that's probably a question that's in some of your minds. But there are some very interesting cultural practices still associated with quinoa production in the high Andean mountains. It was, in fact, the primary staple of the Incan civilization prior to the European conquest. And however, when the Europeans conquered that particular area, they banned the cultivation and use of quinoa, and so its improvement actually has lagged significantly behind, or its cultivation lags significantly behind other crops, which have subsequently been introduced into that region. And it's, of course, still used by the people up there, and it's only recently that governments in this particular area have recognized its value as a food crop for the people who live in that particular area. They're delightful people, by the way. These are some of the slides that I took from a trip we took about a year and a half ago to that region and met some of the people in the villages where they grow quinoa. Okay. Quinoa is an important source of protein and other nutrients. It's the seed that is harvested. It grows on panicles, and they still use some very primitive practices for harvesting and threshing the quinoa. In the villages, they have a whole variety of foods that are made out of quinoa. There are also some commercial operations that are now producing products for distribution in the schools and to the public. And it, as I mentioned, has very high nutritive value. It has very relatively high protein, but it also has an excellent balance of amino acids, which is perfect for human nutrition, particularly for small children. The high Andean Plateau, particularly in Bolivia, is one of the poorest regions of the world and has some severe problems with malnutrition and infant mortality. And quinoa can provide a way for overcoming some of those problems. Now, this is Alejandro Bonifacio, who is our collaborator in Bolivia. He is part of a foundation which is called PROIMPA. It's a foundation for the promotion and what is it in English? Promotion and production of Andean products. And Alejandro is actually an alumnus of Brigham Young University, has a PhD here, which he got with Dr. Daniel Fairbanks. And he is the quinoa breeder in that region. We here at BYU are involved in developing biotechnological tools which the Bolivians can use to improve the crop in their country. And the nice thing is that the PROIMPA Foundation has established outreach programs that allows them to introduce the new varieties that they develop into the villages and to the commercial growers who are there who could most benefit from them. You can imagine if it was only us here at BYU working on this project, we'd have a very difficult time getting that technology to transfer into real products in Bolivia. But because we have this partnership with PROIMPA, it's a lot easier. And here's Alejandro actually showing some farmers how to use a machine that can speed up the process of threshing. It's just turning a crank and blowing the chaff out of the quinoa to separate the seed so that they can use it and store it. This is a photo of a group of us who visited Bolivia several years ago. And what I want to do, and what this photo reminds me of, is to explain to you what we have done here at BYU that is designed to help the Bolivians. We're standing in a field of quinoa. Now, some of the previous photos that you've seen, you can see that the quinoa is much smaller and less productive than this particular field. Now, what has happened is this is a field that was planted by our collaborator, Alejandro Bonifacio, of new varieties that he has developed as part of our collaborative crop research program. These crops are growing on much better soil than the previous crops that I showed, but they're also benefited from genetic improvement through his breeding program. And we are hoping to be able to accelerate his program by providing them these molecular tools. We've developed a series of molecular markers that they're using to characterize their collection. They have 3,000 varieties of quinoa in the Bolivian germplasm collection. That's very labor intensive to try to maintain that collection. They can use our markers to pare that collection down to a much smaller group that's much easier to maintain, but yet will represent the maximum amount of genetic variety that is present in the collection. We've built a genetic map. That is, we've got these DNA markers and we know their positions on the chromosomes and can use that as a tool in accelerating Alejandro's breeding programs. And we're beginning to identify now specific genes that may have some agronomic importance. For instance, we've identified genes that encode proteins that are produced in the seed that may be responsible for its protein content and for its excellent balance of amino acids. We're working on identifying genes that are responsible for salt tolerance in the plant. These plants will grow right on the edge of salt flats where there's a really high salt content in the soil. So we're identifying genes that may be responsible for that particular trait. The seed coat is covered with a bitter compound that they have to wash off, but there are sweet varieties that don't have the bitter compound, and we're in the process of identifying genes that may be responsible for that particular trait. The Bolivians have identified for us some characteristics that they're interested in: protein content, starch content, the seed size, the number of days it takes for the plant to flower, and the sweet versus the bitter varieties. So we're helping them to identify markers that could allow them to breed superior varieties of quinoa. We also have some genomic tools we've built to assist in this project, and we're seeking funding from the National Science Foundation actually to help us to develop some of these genomic tools that will allow us to help the Bolivians to improve their agricultural practices, to have superior varieties of crops, to be able to feed their population. But just as important as these agronomic goals that we have for quinoa is the fact that we've been able to put through our lab and to train in our laboratory well over 100 students, probably even closer to 200 students over the last several years in a mentored research environment in which they have been able to participate directly in a project that can help them to see the connection between biotechnology and increasing food security in the world. And I think that that's a great thing. In the Cochabamba Temple dedication, President Hinckley said in his prayer, "We remember before thee the sons and daughters of Father Lehi. Wilt thou keep thine ancient promises in their behalf? Lift from their shoulders the burdens of poverty and cause the shackles of darkness to fall from their eyes. May they rise to the glories of the past. May they recognize their Redeemer and be faithful and true saints of the Most High. May they seek learning out of the best books. May the enlightenment of education bring new and wonderful opportunities into their lives." As stewards of the earth and as Christian disciples, we feel that we are helping to bring to fulfillment President Hinckley's prophecy, which he made in this prayer. And it brings a great deal of satisfaction to us and to our students. And I appreciate your attention today. Thank you very much.